Tonight we stay up late with Kenneth Arnold, remembered as the man who gave the world the phrase flying saucer, though he spent his life insisting it was never quite what he meant. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. On the 24th of June, 1947, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying a small aircraft across the Cascade Range in Washington state. He was a businessman by trade out of Boise, Idaho, and he sold fire suppression equipment. He flew the mountains the way other men drove the highways, for work on his own schedule in his own plane. Flying that country was nothing unusual for him. It was another workday. He knew the Cascades from the air, the long green folds of them and the white peaks standing up out of them, and he was not a man given to seeing things that were not there. On this particular afternoon, he had a reason to slow down and look. A marine transport plane had gone down somewhere near Mount Rainier, and there was a reward posted, a fair sum, for whoever found the wreck. So Arnold, with time and daylight in hand, turned off his route and went looking for it. That is the first thing to hold on to about this whole affair, and it is easy to lose under everything that came after. He was not hunting for the strange. He was hunting for one lost airplane in the hope of the reward, and he never found it. What he found instead was a flash of light. It came a little before 3 in the afternoon, off to his left, near the great white shoulder of Mount Rainier. A flash so brief he almost dismissed it, like sun catching a mirror. His first thought was another aircraft, dangerously close, and he looked hard around his own plane for it. There was nothing near him. And then the flashing came again, and this time it resolved into a shape, or rather into 9 of them, a long chain of bright objects strung out across the sky ahead, moving toward the peak. He did the ordinary things a careful pilot does. He rocked his own aircraft to see if the light was a reflection off his glass. Off came his glasses, and he looked again. Later, he rolled his side window down and looked with nothing between his eyes and the air. The objects were still there. They were flying in a long, stepped line, weaving between the smaller peaks, catching the sun and throwing it back in flashes as they banked. He looked for wings and for tails, the way you would on any aircraft, and he could not find them. There was a clock set into his instrument panel, an ordinary aircraft clock, and Arnold, being the sort of man he was, decided to time the thing rather than simply marvel at it. He picked a landmark the objects were passing, and he waited for them to reach the next one, and he watched the second hand go around. It is a small, practical act, and the rest of his life quietly turned on it. Arnold wanted something he could measure. Measurements could be checked, impressions could not. A number was something he could hold. He got it. Let the plane hang there a moment in the clear June air and take the sighting slowly, because it was over quickly, and quickness is the enemy of a story told at this hour. The objects crossed in front of Mount Rainier, dark now in profile against the snow, and Arnold watched them go. They were thin, he would say, and flat. He kept reaching for kitchen shapes to describe them, a pie pan, a disc, something rounded in front and cut off behind. 8 of them held that shape. One did not. One was more like a crescent and rode a little apart from the others. They flew, he said, not in the steady way of aircraft, but with a weaving, dipping motion, like the tail of a kite in a high wind, tilting and flashing as they turned. He was not frightened exactly. He was a working pilot watching something fly in a way he had never seen anything fly, and the working pilot in him was busy, measuring, timing, comparing them against the far white peaks. What he kept coming back to afterward was what he could not see. There were no wings. There were no tails, no fuselage, none of the parts a pilot's eye goes hunting for to make sense of a thing in the air. Something that size moving like that should have carried all of it, and it carried none. It should have come with a wall of engine noise, too, a formation crossing in front of him that close, and there was nothing he could hear over his own motor. A lifetime in the sky had taught him what airplanes were, and this was most of what stayed with him. Not a strange shape, but the familiar shapes that were missing. They went from Mount Rainier toward Mount Adams, the next great peak to the south, and Arnold watched the clock. A little over a minute and a half, that was the span from the one mountain to the other by the second hand in front of him. He knew that stretch of country. He knew, roughly, how far it was between those peaks. And when he worked it out afterward, on the ground, with a pencil, the number he got was one he did not quite believe himself. So he made it smaller. The speed he had worked out was far past anything that flew in those years, a year still before the sound barrier had even been broken. Arnold did not round it up to impress anyone. He rounded it down. He shaved it to a figure he could defend, and even that was well beyond any machine then known. A man exaggerating for attention does not trim his own best number. Arnold trimmed his. The smaller figure was the one he could stand behind, and standing behind things was his whole character. Then it was over. The objects reached Mount Adams and thinned and were gone into the distance the way a flight of birds is suddenly gone, there, and then a strain of the eye, and then nothing. The sky over the Cascades was empty and blue and entirely ordinary. Under 3 minutes had passed, start to finish. Then the ordinary came back all at once. The mountains went back to being mountains. The engine, which he had stopped hearing, was loud in his ears again. Nothing else crossed the sky. There was the airplane, and the afternoon, and a man alone in a cockpit with something he had nowhere to put. He had the better part of an hour of ordinary flying left, and he flew it with that. The country went by underneath exactly as it had before, the wheat fields, the roads, the small towns, none of it aware that anything had happened. He did not yet know whether he would tell a soul. The fields slid past, and the thing turned over in his mind, unshared and unexplained until the wheels came down. He flew on to Yakima and then to Pendleton, Oregon, and along the way, he told a few other pilots what he had seen. They did what pilots do. They offered ordinary answers, guided missiles, some new machine the Army was flying and not talking about. Arnold half wanted one of those answers to be true. But he had the clock's number in his pocket, and the shape of the thing in his eye, and no wings anywhere in the memory. He landed at Pendleton with a story he did not know what to do with, and no idea at all that by naming it out loud to a reporter, he was about to lose control of it forever. Before we go on, it is worth setting down the bare record once, plainly, the way a clerk would file it. On the 24th of June, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying over the Cascade Range in Washington State, searching for a downed military transport. A little before 3 in the afternoon, near Mount Rainier, he saw 9 bright objects flying in a long chain, weaving between the peaks at a speed he could not account for. He timed their passage from Mount Rainier to Mount Adams on the clock in his instrument panel. He landed, told the story to reporters in Pendleton, Oregon, and within days it had reached front pages across the country. Describing how the objects moved, Arnold reached for a comparison. A saucer skipped across water, and from that comparison the newspapers settled on a phrase, flying saucer. The objects were never explained. The phrase never went away. That is the record. Now, the word. When Arnold landed at Pendleton, he went the next day to the East Oregonian, the local daily in a wheat and cattle town, and told what he had seen to two reporters there, a man named Bill Beckett among them. They took him for what he was, sober, specific, selling nothing. Beckett wrote it up plainly, and this is the part that matters. He handed it to the Associated Press wire, the shared pipe that carried a local story out to every paper in the country. A pilot's odd afternoon over the Cascades left Pendleton that day as a few paragraphs of wire copy. By the next morning it had come down in newsrooms from coast to coast, and in each of them a different editor, working fast against a deadline, had to find a few words to set over it. That is where the phrase was born, not in Arnold's mouth and not in any one of those rooms, but in most of them at once, all reaching for the same easy image. Here is the thing almost everyone gets slightly wrong, and it is the whole of the story, so it is worth getting right. Arnold did not say the objects were shaped like saucers. What he said, reaching, the way any of us reaches when we are trying to describe a motion we have no name for, was that they moved a certain way. They flew, he said, the way a saucer would if you skipped it across water, that low, skimming, dipping flight. He was describing the motion. He was, if anything, careful about the shapes themselves, which he compared to pie pans and crescents and discs. But motion is hard to print, and a shape is easy, and somewhere between Arnold's mouth in Pendleton and the front pages of the next morning, the comparison came loose from the thing it described. It is not even clear that any one person did it or meant to. The historians who have gone back through the newspapers of those few days cannot point to a single reporter and say, "There, that one, that is who coined it." It seems to have formed in the space between the telephone and the headline, the wire services, the copy desks, the editors reaching for 3 quick words to sit over a strange story. The phrase that came out was flying saucer. And it was perfect, and it was wrong, and it was everywhere by the end of the week. The clock had measured seconds. The headlines did not measure anything at all. Arnold watched it happen and could not stop it. He gave more interviews, and in every one of them he tried to set the record straight. It was the motion, he kept saying, not the shape. And every correction sank without a trace beneath the phrase itself, which was already off and running, already being printed over sightings in other states, other countries, by people who had never heard his name and never would. The word had left him. It belonged to the newspapers now, and to everyone who read them, and it was busy becoming the name of a whole era of the strange, an era Kenneth Arnold had started by accident and would spend the rest of his life standing slightly outside of, correcting a sentence no one wanted corrected. What happens to an ordinary man when the whole country decides it knows what he said? For a while it came as a flood, and it came to his door. Arnold ran his business out of Boise, and the mail that had once been orders and invoices now arrived by the sack. He would sit with it, letter after letter, at the desk of a man who sold fire extinguishers for a living, people who had seen their own lights in their own skies, people with theories, people who wanted him to know the objects were angels or Russians or visitors from another world, and a good number who simply wanted to tell him he was a fool. He said to one reporter that half the people looked at him as some combination of Einstein, Flash Gordon, and a screwball, and that he wondered what his wife back in Idaho was making of it all. It is a funny line, and it is not really a funny line. It is a practical man discovering that his own name has stopped being his, the way his own words already had. The teasing found him the way it finds the reluctant, more than it ever finds the willing. He had not gone looking for any of this. He had gone looking for a downed plane. And now he was the flying saucer man, in the diners and at the airfields, for the rest of his life. The official world was no kinder, in its own flat way. The Army looked into the sightings and interviewed him, and the men who sat with him came away plainly convinced he was telling the truth as he knew it. One of them wrote that it was hard to believe a man of his character would make such a report if he had not seen something. And the explanation the Army eventually offered in public came down to a single word: mirage. He had seen, they said, a trick of the light off the mountains. He could not let it lie, and trying not to let it lie pulled him somewhere he did not belong. A magazine editor drew him into looking at another case down on Maury Island in Puget Sound, a murky, tangled business that turned out to be mostly hoax. 2 military officers who had gathered material from that investigation died when their plane went down on the flight home, and a whisper went around that the plane had been brought down on purpose. The whisper was never anything more than a whisper, but Arnold was near enough to feel the cold of it. He had wanted, in the beginning, only to be believed. Instead, he found himself wandering the edges of a world of hoaxes and rumors and men who died in crashes, a world with his accidental phrase written all over it and no clean way back out. And somewhere in all of that is the moment the whole episode turns on. It is not the sighting. The sighting was 3 clear minutes he was always sure of. It is quieter than that, and worse, the moment Arnold understood that the correcting would never work, that he could say it was the motion, not the shape 1,000 times, in 1,000 rooms, and the phrase would go on exactly as it was, because it had stopped being about him at all. He had described something carefully once, and the world had taken the description and remade it, and handed him back a name he never chose, and there was nothing, not one thing, he could do about it. The careful man had become the saucer man. He would go on defending a record no one would let him fix. Pull the camera back for a moment before it settles on him again, because the accident he set off did not stay small. His sighting, and the wave of others that followed it that summer, landed on desks in Washington, and the men at those desks could not agree on what to do with them, and the disagreement itself became a kind of machine. Arnold's case was one of the ones they could not comfortably file away. It became one of the pushes, not the only one, but a real one, that moved the Army toward a formal study of these things, the study that would be called Project Sign, and then Project Grudge, and at last the long-running one most people have heard of, Project Blue Book. None of that happened because Kenneth Arnold proved anything. It happened because he made the institutions respond. A man looking for a lost airplane had, by accident, obliged his government to open a filing cabinet it would keep open for the better part of 30 years. Now let the camera come back to him, because that is where this belongs. Arnold himself got no reward from any of it. He wrote a book once, trying to set his own record down in his own words. He ran for office in Idaho and lost. And as the years went on, he grew tired and then bitter about the one thing that had never stopped stinging. That people kept questioning his honesty, his character, the plain report of a plain man. In his later years, he mostly stopped talking about it. He turned down the interviews and let the flying saucer world go on without him. He had said what he saw. The saying had cost him more than it was ever worth, and he was done spending himself on it. But hold the other half of it, the half that is easy to let slip. History remembers the phrase. The phrase became famous, more famous than the man, more famous than the mountains. But the phrase was never the thing Arnold was trying to describe, and underneath it the whole time the plainer mystery has gone on, sitting there, unbothered and unanswered. 9 bright objects crossed in front of Mount Rainier that afternoon, weaving between the peaks, and thinned into the distance past Mount Adams, and were never explained by anyone. Not by the Army, not by the mirage, not by the years. The word is not the answer to that mystery. The word is only part of it. Go back at the very last to the clock. To the small, practical act of a man in a cockpit waiting for a second hand to come around, wanting a number he could stand behind. He measured the minutes correctly. He described the movement correctly. The only thing he could not control was what the world decided to call it, and the world decided quickly and never changed its mind. Everything came after that afternoon. Thousands of people in the years since have reported strange things in the sky. Some of those stories faded and were forgotten. Some grew in the telling. A few hardened into legends that will outlast everyone who ever argued about them. And nearly all of them trace back, if the line is followed far enough, to one working pilot, one ordinary afternoon over these mountains, and one sentence that history quietly changed on its way to the front page. So let that be the last of it. Nearly everyone alive knows the phrase flying saucer. It is in every language now, over every strange light in every sky. Almost no one knows the name of the man who spent his life insisting he had never quite meant it that way. Somewhere over the Cascades tonight, the peaks are standing where they always stood, dark against the last of the light, and the air between them is empty and blue and ordinary. And a careful pilot who once looked for one lost airplane and found 9 of something else and reached for his clock instead of a word, carried that afternoon and everything the world made of it quietly to the end of his days. We traced the line for a little while between the world you know and the one just beyond it. Rest now. The night will keep watch. See you in time.